Close your eyes, listen. Can you hear it? The soft rhythmic whisper of waves against ancient stone, the Mediterranean, gentle tonight, rolling in with the patience of 10,000 years. There is salt in the air, that sharp mineral sweetness that has drawn travellers and seekers to these waters since the beginning of human memory. And beneath it, the faint woody perfume of burning olive branches drifting from a distant fire, smoke curling up into the star-thick sky above. The night is clear here, impossibly clear, and the stars are so bright they seem close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens like a river of light, and if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear something beneath the waves. A voice, perhaps. A song carried on the wind. The sound of time itself moving backward, pulling us towards something ancient and essential and eternally human. Tonight, we travel back 25 centuries, 2,500 years of history compressed into the space of your sleep, to a land of gods and monsters, where a handful of city-states invented democracy, philosophy, theatre, mathematics, and the very idea of Western civilization. We travel to ancient Greece, and our journey begins not with dates and dynasties, but with geography, with the bones of the land itself, for it was the shape of the earth that made Greece what it became, that carved the character of its people into stone as immutable as the mountains that surrounded them. The Greek world was not a unified kingdom, not an empire administered from a distant capital, but rather a fractal civilization, a collection of independent, fiercely proud city-states scattered across mountains and islands, like pearls on a rough string. The mainland itself is a land of dramatic verticality. The Pindus Mountains run like a spine down the centre of Greece, creating natural barriers that isolated one valley from another, one people from their neighbours. The mountains are not forgiving. They are jagged and steep, covered in pine and scrub, and they made roads difficult, trade complicated, unity almost impossible. A journey of merely 50 miles across a Greek landscape might take weeks of climbing and descending, navigating passes and gorges. These mountains created isolation, and isolation bred independence. Each town, each valley, each settlement that clung to the steep slopes developed its own way of life, its own laws, its own gods, its own identity. But the mountains are only part of the geography. Perhaps even more important is the sea. The Aegean stretches out from the Greek mainland like an invitation, dotted with thousands of islands, some no more than rocky outcrops, others large enough for entire civilizations. The Greeks looked at this sea and they did not see a barrier. They saw a highway, they saw opportunity, they saw connection. Where landlocked civilizations built walls and forged empires through conquest, the Greeks took to the water. They became sailors, merchants, explorers, colonists. The sea was their frontier, it was their dreams made liquid, and this meant that while the mountains kept the mainland cities separate, the sea connected them, trading goods and ideas and blood, creating a vast network of related but fiercely independent communities. The olive trees that covered the hillsides, the figs that grew wild, the wine that fermented in stone jars in the coolness of cellars carved into rock. These connected Greeks to Greeks across vast distances. A ship from Athens might carry olive oil to a colony in Sicily, bring back grain and amber, carry news and gossip and stories that would become the myths that bound the Greek world together. This unique geography, mountains creating isolation, the sea creating connection, produced a civilization unlike any that had come before. The mountains shaped the character of the Greeks. They learned self-reliance in those steep valleys, learned to be fierce in defense of their small territories, learned to treasure their independence above all else. They climbed those slopes every day, breathed that mountain air, heard the wind howl through passes at night, and something in their character hardened and clarified. They became a people who could not submit to distant rulers, who demanded a voice in their own governance, who valued courage and stood their ground when others might have retreated. But the sea called to them as well, and when they heard that call, they answered it with the same intensity with which they defended their mountains. They became explorers, traders, warriors of the sea as much as the land. This duality, the independent mountain people and the adventurous seafarers, would define Greek civilization from its earliest moments. And before we speak of the height of Greek civilization, before we meet the Spartans and the Athenians and the philosophers and the warriors and the artists who would change the world forever, we must travel further back still. We must meet the people who came first, the people who showed the way, the Minoans. Imagine walking through time backward, down centuries like descending a spiral staircase into darkness. Backward past the golden age of Athens and Sparta, backward past the Trojan War and the legendary heroes, backward and backward until we reach roughly the year 2700 before Christ was born. The world at this time is a very different place. Egypt is already old, with centuries of pharaohs already entombed in pyramids and mastabas along the Nile. Mesopotamia has risen and risen again. But Greece, mainland Greece, is still emerging, still finding its voice. And yet on the island of Crete something extraordinary is taking shape. Here a civilization blooms. The Minoans. Who were they? Where did they come from? The truth is, we do not entirely know. They do not appear in our records as a sudden invasion or conquest. Rather, they seem to have emerged from the island itself, a people who took the natural wealth of Crete, its position on trade routes, its volcanic soil, its access to the sea, and transformed it into something magnificent. By around 1700 before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization was at its height, and the centerpiece of their world was the Palace of Knossos. Imagine approaching this palace as an ancient visitor might have. You would see it first from a distance, a structure rising up on a gentle slope, built of stone blocks and timber, its outline seeming to grow from the earth itself. As you drew closer, you would see that it was not built in any regular geometrical pattern. There was no symmetry, no rigid plan. Instead, it seemed to have grown organically, as if the builders had simply added rooms and corridors wherever they were needed, creating an astonishing complexity of interconnected spaces. Picture it in your mind, not a fortress with high defensive walls, but a palace, a sprawling labyrinthian complex of connected chambers and corridors and courtyards painted in vivid colours, decorated with frescoes of such delicate, joyful beauty that when archaeologists first discovered them in the 20th century, they could barely believe that people 2,500 years before their time had created such art. This palace was vast, covering more than 13,000 square metres, containing hundreds of rooms, arranged on multiple levels that rose and descended in a bewildering sequence. The walls were covered with images of nature, dolphins leaping through water, flowers blooming in gardens, birds in flight. And everywhere there were people, priests and priestesses, acrobats, musicians, dancing figures with impossibly narrow waists and elaborate fashions. It was a celebration of life, of beauty, of joy. The Palace of Knossos was not a place designed for defence or conquest. It was a place designed for living, for comfort, for art, for pleasure. The rooms opened onto the courtyards. The light came through windows and skylights. Water ran through the palace via a sophisticated system of pipes and channels. There were baths. There were storage rooms filled with giant ceramic vessels called pithoi, some large enough to contain a man, used to store grain and wine and precious oils. There were workshops where artisans, some of the finest craftspeople in the ancient world, created pottery of exquisite design and delicate, intricate frescoes that have survived the millennia. This was a civilization that valued art and beauty as much as strength and power. It was a civilization that seemed, by all evidence, to have been remarkably peaceful. There are no depictions of warfare in Minoan art, no scenes of conquest or enslavement, no great military monuments, just people, living, creating, celebrating the abundance of their island. The Minoans traded extensively throughout the Mediterranean. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in Syria, in Anatolia. Cretan ships carried wine and oil, crafted goods and ideas across the sea. They built ships of a sophistication that rivaled any in the ancient world. Imagine these ships, double-hulled vessels with sails and oars, manned by skilled sailors who understood the rhythms of wind and wave. They would depart from Cretan harbours and sail south to Egypt, where they would trade their fine pottery and wine for grain and papyrus and the precious goods of the Nile Valley. They would sail east to the coasts of Asia Minor and Syria, where they traded with peoples whose names have been lost to time. They would sail to the islands of the Aegean, spreading Minoan culture like seeds on the wind. The sea routes became highways of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas, styles, religious practices, artistic techniques. And their culture, their art, Their way of life spread throughout the islands of the Aegean. Other cultures borrowed from them, imitated them, were fascinated by them. For several hundred years, Minoan civilization was the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. Kings and rulers far away were impressed by Cretan craftsmanship, Cretan art, Cretan taste. In the centuries to come, when Greeks told stories of a great civilization that had existed in the distant past, they would remember the Minoans. The legends would become distorted, exaggerated, transformed, but the memory would endure. You might say that the Minoans created the first international style in the Mediterranean world, the first moment when art and taste became something that crossed boundaries and unified peoples who had never met. One of the most striking aspects of Minoan civilization was its religious practice, centered on a great goddess figure, the mother goddess, a deity represented in art with bare breasts, dressed in elaborate clothing, sometimes shown holding serpents or with doves resting on her head. This goddess seems to have been the central religious figure of the Minoan world, and priestesses, women, seem to have held prominent roles in religious ceremonies. Some of these ceremonies took place in specially designated areas within the palace, but others took place on mountaintops, in caves, in the open air. One practice, depicted repeatedly in Minoan art, was bull leaping. Young acrobats, male and female, engaging in what appears to be a sacred ritual involving a charging bull. In the frescoes, they seem almost to be dancing with the animal, grasping its horns, vaulting over its back. Whether this was an actual practice or a ritual that existed more in art and legend, we cannot be entirely certain. But the image speaks to something essential about Minoan culture, a civilization that was not afraid to mix danger with beauty, that saw joy and risk as part of a sacred whole. And yet the Minoans left us great mysteries. The most enduring mystery is also the most catastrophic question. What happened to them? At their height, around 1450 before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization seems to have suddenly collapsed. The great palace complexes were destroyed, the cities were abandoned, the elaborate culture that had flourished for so many centuries vanished, almost overnight, into the mists of time. For centuries, archaeologists and historians puzzled over this. What catastrophe could have befallen such a civilization? What war? What plague? What rebellion? The answer, when it finally emerged from geological science, was perhaps even more dramatic than scholars had imagined. Around 1600 to 1500 before the Common Era, the dating is uncertain, the island of Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera, underwent one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Imagine the sound of that eruption, the way the ground would have shook, the way the sky would have filled with ash. The volcano, which stood perhaps 2,000 meters tall, essentially exploded. It collapsed inward, creating a massive caldera, a crater nearly 500 meters deep. The eruption itself would have been preceded by earthquakes. Ash would have fallen on the surrounding islands, darkening the sky, poisoning crops. And then came the tsunami, a wave created by the catastrophic displacement of water caused by the collapse of the volcano. This wave would have swept outward across the Aegean, washing over islands and coastlines, destroying ports and harbours and settlements. Crete, just 100 kilometres to the south, would have been devastated. The coastal settlements would have been destroyed. The economy, based on sea trade, would have been shattered. Crops would have failed for years due to volcanic ash. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled in hours. Some scholars believe that this catastrophe, this almost biblical destruction, may have been the origin of the Atlantis legend. Plato, the great Greek philosopher, would write centuries later of a great civilization destroyed in a single night and day, swallowed by the sea. Was he remembering in his imagination the fall of the Minoans? Was Atlantis a distant folk memory of Crete's fall? We cannot be sure, but the parallels are striking enough that many have wondered. A great civilization, technologically advanced, wealthy, cultured, destroyed not by enemy hands but by the fury of the earth itself. The Minoans did not entirely disappear after this catastrophe, but their golden age was over. The civilizations that followed, most notably the Mycenaeans, would inherit some of Minoan art and culture, but the unique world of the Minoans, their particular vision of how to live, would not be recovered. But if the Minoans were the first spark of civilization in the Greek world, it was the Mycenaeans who brought steel and discipline and ambition to the stage. If you travel forward in time from the fall of the Minoans, forward a couple of centuries into the Bronze Age, You find yourself in the world of the Mycenaeans, a civilization based on the mainland of Greece rather than on the islands, centered in the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula. The Mycenaeans were different from the Minoans in fundamental ways, where the Minoans seem to have been traders and craftspeople, artists and priests. The Mycenaeans were warriors. They lived in a world of strict hierarchies, of kings and nobles and common people, of conquest and domination. Where Minoan art celebrated nature and joy and a kind of serene abundance, Mycenaean art, what survives to us at least, focuses on power, on military might, on the dominance of the royal figure. The greatest symbol of Mycenaean power is the Lion Gate at Mycenae, still standing today in the Peloponnese. Two great stone lions carved in relief flank a gateway, a monumental structure that announces to anyone approaching, "Power lives here. Do not trifle with this place." The Mycenaeans built massive citadels, fortified with enormous walls made of stone so large that later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants, and called such structures Cyclopean, the work of the Cyclops. The Mycenaeans accumulated wealth. In the graves of their kings, we have found gold death masks of extraordinary craftsmanship, faces frozen in metal, preserving the likeness of men who died millennia ago. One of these masks, discovered by German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, bore such a regal bearing and such an air of authority that he declared it to be the death mask of Agamemnon, the legendary king who led the Greeks in the Trojan War. Whether it actually belonged to Agamemnon we cannot know, but the discovery itself speaks to something profound. The Mycenaeans were real. They were not pure myth. They had lived, had ruled, had shaped history. And this brings us to one of history's greatest questions. Was the Trojan War real? Did it actually happen, or is it pure mythology, invented by Homer and poets of his tradition? For centuries the answer seemed obvious. It was myth, a beautiful story, but not history. Then, in the 1870s, a controversial German archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann began excavations in Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, at a site called Hisarlik. And there he found something that astonished the world. The ruins of an ancient city, layer upon layer of them, cities built one atop another across the centuries. The layers of ash suggested fires, destruction, conquest. Could this be Troy? Could this be the Troy of Homer? The city that the Greeks had attacked and conquered and burned, according to the ancient epic tales? Schliemann believed so, and his conviction inspired generations of scholars to take a second look at what they had dismissed as pure mythology. In the 20th century, scholars found evidence of a real Mycenaean presence in the region, real warfare and conquest, real battles between mainland Greeks and the forces of Anatolia. The truth, almost certainly, is this. The Trojan War was not exactly as Homer described it. It didn't last exactly 10 years. It was not fought over a woman named Helen, though there may have been conflicts and trade disputes and territorial struggles. But something happened, some real conflict, some real destruction, and the memory of that conflict, passed down through centuries in the oral tradition, eventually crystallized into the epic story that Homer composed, probably around 750 before the Common Era. The Iliad is not history in the modern sense. It is history filtered through poetry, through legend, through the imaginations of countless storytellers. But it is not entirely invention either. It is something in between. A beautiful, magnificent blending of what was real and what was imagined, and in that blending, something almost more true than bare fact emerges. The story tells us something real about the Mycenaeans, about their codes of honor, their warrior values, their understanding of fate and courage and death. But by Homer's time, the Mycenaean civilization itself had long since fallen. Somewhere around 1100 before the Common Era, the Mycenaean world collapsed. The citadels were destroyed, the kingdoms fell, the great palaces were abandoned, trade networks broke down, writing disappeared. The Linear B script, which the Mycenaeans had used to record their administration and trade, fell out of use. For nearly 300 years, Greece entered what we now call the Dark Ages, not because nothing happened, but because the curtain of writing was drawn, and we have almost no written records. It is a darkness not of absence, but of silence. What happened in those 3 centuries? We can only piece it together from archaeological evidence, from the gradual changes we see in pottery styles, from the legendary traditions that survived in oral form. Some scholars believe the Mycenaean collapse was caused by invasion, perhaps by the mysterious Sea Peoples, raiders who attacked civilizations throughout the Mediterranean in the 12th century. Others point to earthquakes, climate change, internal conflict. The truth is probably a combination of factors. Wars weakened the kingdoms, natural disasters disrupted trade and agriculture, invaders may have pressed at the borders. Whatever the causes, the result was clear. A civilization that had built great palaces and accumulated great wealth, that had traded throughout the Mediterranean and conquered enemies, suddenly fell into fragmentation. The people who lived through it did not experience it as a dark ages, of course. They experienced it as transformation, as loss and survival, migration and adaptation. Some Mycenaean Greeks fled, to Cyprus, to the coast of Anatolia, to other islands. Some settled inland, away from the coasts. Some mingled with newcomers, with Indo-European peoples who had migrated south from the Balkans. Slowly, over the centuries, the Greek world was remade, and then, gradually, light returned. Around 800 before the Common Era, after 300 years of silence, we hear voice again. The Greeks had adopted a new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians, modified to suit their own language. This was a profound shift. The Greek alphabet, unlike the syllabaries and logograms of earlier Mediterranean civilizations, was phonetic. Each letter represented a sound. This meant that any Greek speaker could learn to read and write in a remarkably short time. It was a technology that democratized literacy, that made writing accessible not just to a professional class of scribes, but to ordinary people. This alphabet, once adopted, spread like wildfire throughout the Greek world. With this new tool for recording language, they could write again. And what did they write first? They wrote epic poetry. The great bard Homer, or perhaps a tradition of bards who shared that name, composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two greatest epics of ancient Greece. These poems did not simply capture contemporary life, though they did that. They reached backward through the centuries, back to the memory of the Mycenaean age, and they crystallized that memory into art. They transformed the collapse of a civilization into the story of a great war fought by heroes, and in doing so, they preserved something essential about what that civilization had been, its values, its codes, its understanding of courage and fate. Picture Homer composing these epics. Perhaps he was a blind bard, as legend says, moving from town to town, reciting the stories to audiences gathered around him in the firelight. His words would have been committed to memory by his listeners, transmitted orally from person to person, city to city, island to island, until eventually they were written down and formalized into the text we know today. The Iliad and the Odyssey did something that might seem simple, but was absolutely revolutionary. They gave the Greeks a shared past. Until these epics were written and widely known, the Greeks were fragmented, a collection of independent peoples, each with local traditions and local gods. The epics created a common mythology, a shared set of stories and heroes and values that bound them together even as they remained politically independent. Every Greek city-state claimed descent from heroes in those epics. Every Greek knew the story of the Great War at Troy, the adventures of Odysseus, the courage of Achilles, the wisdom of Nestor. These stories created Greek identity. They were shared across the vast network of the Greek world, carried by traders and sailors, recited by poets and storytellers, eventually written down and copied and spread. The epics were the glue that held a fractured civilization together. This is a good moment to pause and offer you the gentlest of reminders about how you're spending this time. This is the Calm Archive, a place where we tell stories not as mere entertainment, but as a kind of medicine for the weary mind. You are listening to this story now in service of your own rest, your own peace, your own journey towards sleep. The ancient world we're describing, these mountains and seas, these peoples and their struggles and triumphs, they are not separate from you. They are part of the foundation on which you stand. The ideas that will emerge from this Greek world, democracy, reason, beauty, the notion that humans can question and debate and decide their own future, these ideas shape your world still. So as we move forward in this journey, know that you're not simply learning about the past. You're discovering the roots of who you are, and in that discovery there is peace. In the centuries after Homer, the Greek world changed dramatically. The fragmentation we spoke of, those mountains creating isolation, began to be bridged not by empire but by something new, the polis, the city-state. The polis was a peculiarly Greek invention. It was not a kingdom ruled by a distant monarch, nor was it a tribe united by blood or clan. Rather, it was a city, often built on a defensible hilltop surrounded by agricultural land, united by law and shared citizenship. Think of a polis as a world unto itself, a complete social and political organism. Within its boundaries lived not thousands of subjects of a distant king, but citizens, people who belonged to a community, who had a voice in how that community was governed, who shared in its risks and its rewards. The polis had a centre, called the agora, a marketplace, but also the civic heart, where assemblies gathered, where business was conducted, where the citizens of the polis made decisions about their common life. In many ways, the agora was the soul of the polis. It was here that gossip was exchanged, that news was shared, that philosophy was discussed, that the business of governance took place. It was here that a humble farmer might stand next to an aristocrat, that the poor had a voice just as the rich did. This was revolutionary in the ancient world. This was revolutionary. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Persia, power flowed downward from a king or emperor. In the polis, power theoretically flowed from the people themselves. At least that was the aspiration, the direction toward which the Greek polis tended. In practice, at first, most city-states were ruled by aristocracies or by tyrants, but the very existence of the polis created conditions for something new, the possibility of political debate, of law derived from human reasoning rather than divine command, of citizenship as a status that carried both rights and responsibilities. The polis was where the Greeks invented the very idea that human beings could govern themselves through reason and discussion rather than through the will of a single powerful figure. By around 750 before the Common Era, as Homer was composing his epics, the Greek world was expanding. A period of Greek colonization began, prompted by population pressure in the homeland, by the search for new farmland, by the trader's instinct to find new markets. Greeks began to establish settlements throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. They founded colonies on the coast of Anatolia, the region called Ionia. They established settlements in Sicily and southern Italy, regions so thoroughly colonized by Greeks that the Romans would later call the area Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. They created outposts in Egypt, in North Africa, on the shores of the Black Sea. The sea, that great highway we spoke of, became an avenue for Greek expansion. Everywhere these colonists went, they brought with them the idea of the polis, the city-state, the idea that humans could govern themselves. But not all polis evolved in the same direction. And as we move forward in time toward the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, we must meet the two cities that would dominate Greek history and that would represent two profoundly different answers to the question of how to organize human life, Athens and Sparta. Let us first turn to Sparta, for Sparta is in many ways the older of these two civilizations, and its origins lie in the period of turmoil we have been describing, the Dark Ages and the century after, in the region of the Peloponnese. When the Indo-European Dorians migrated into the Peloponnese, probably sometime in the 11th or 10th century before the Common Era, they encountered a population of Greek people who had lived there since the Mycenaean collapse. Rather than peacefully coexist, the Dorians conquered these people. They established a warrior society in the region we know as Sparta, in an area called Laconia. And over the next centuries they engaged in what would become a defining act of their civilization, the conquest of a neighbouring region called Messenia. This conquest took more than 100 years and was ferociously resisted. But eventually the Spartans prevailed, and they enslaved the entire population of Messenia. These enslaved people were not called slaves but helots, and the helots became the foundation of Spartan society. This is where Sparta's history becomes truly extraordinary and truly strange. A Spartan citizen, and the word citizen here is crucial, was not a merchant or a farmer or a labourer. A Spartan citizen was a warrior, nothing else. The entire economic system of Sparta was designed to free the citizen from having to work. The helots farmed the land, the helots produced the food. The helots built the houses and made the clothes and performed every labour that sustained life. The Spartan citizen, freed from this burden, devoted himself entirely to war, to the perfection of military skill, to the creation of the most efficient fighting force ever assembled. This was not a society that happened to have a strong army. This was a society that existed for no other purpose than to create and maintain an army. The mechanism through which this was accomplished was called the agoge, a system of education and training that would begin at age 7 and continue in various forms throughout a man's life. A 7-year-old boy, at the command of the state, was taken from his mother and placed into a system of military training. He trained with other boys of his age, under the supervision of older men who had already passed through the agoge themselves. The training was harsh. Boys were deliberately underfed to teach them to fend for themselves, to scavenge, to survive on very little. They were taught to fight, to endure pain, to never surrender, to prefer death to dishonor. They were trained to move in perfect formations, to obey orders without question, to subordinate their individual will to the will of the state. By the time a boy emerged from this system as a young man, he was a weapon, honed and perfected, ready to kill and willing to die. He had been taught that pain was not something to avoid, but something to transcend. He had learned to move in unison with thousands of others, to become part of something larger than himself. He had been stripped of every softness, every weakness, every vestige of individuality that might slow him down or make him hesitate. In his place had been forged something new, a warrior, a servant of the state, a man for whom the collective was everything and the individual nothing. The Spartan diet itself reflected this philosophy. The famous Spartan black broth, a soup made from pork, blood and salt, was the staple food. It was not meant to be delicious. It was meant to sustain. It was fuel, nothing more. A story is told that a non-Spartan once tasted the black broth and declared it revolting. "Now I understand," he said, "why Spartans are so fearless in battle. You have nothing to live for." The Spartans had stripped away every comfort, every pleasure, every softness from their way of life. They did not surround themselves with beautiful things. They did not cultivate art or music or literature. Their pottery was plain. Their clothing was simple. Their buildings were functional. Every aspect of life was designed to serve the purpose of creating warriors and maintaining the state. Life was training for war. War was the purpose of life. A Spartan was not supposed to live a long life, to grow old, to retire into comfort. A Spartan was supposed to die young on the battlefield, with his spear in hand and glory in his name. This was the highest ideal, the ultimate honor. To live a long life was almost shameful. It meant you had never had the opportunity to die gloriously, which meant you had never achieved the perfection that Sparta demanded. And yet, and this is important, for it complicates any simple judgment, the women of Sparta occupied a place unique in the ancient Greek world. While Athenian women were largely confined to the home, veiled and secluded, expected to be silent in public, Spartan women had a freedom that would have astounded women from other Greek cities. Imagine being a woman in another Greek city, say, Athens. You would rarely leave your home. Your world would be the interior of a house, the company of other women, perhaps some household slaves. You would be under the guardianship of a man. First your father, then your husband, then perhaps your son or a male relative. You would not appear in public. You would not speak in assemblies. Your education would be minimal, basic domestic training, nothing more. Now imagine being a Spartan woman. Everything is different. Spartan women exercised, ran, wrestled, played sports, naked, like the men, which would have been unthinkable elsewhere in Greece. They were educated, not in the agoge, which was reserved for men, but in a system that taught them music, poetry, and athletic skill. They participated in public religious ceremonies. They could own property. They could speak in public. They could divorce. They wore light clothing, which scandalized more conservative Greeks, and they moved freely in society. Foreign visitors to Sparta were often shocked by the freedom of Spartan women, their boldness, their education, their ability to converse intelligently on matters of politics and philosophy. The reason for this was simple. The Spartans believed that women who were strong, healthy, and well-trained would produce strong, healthy children for the state. The role of a Spartan woman was to be a mother of warriors. This was not liberation in the modern sense. Her entire existence was still defined in relation to her role as bearer of sons. But it was, within the context of ancient Greece, a remarkable degree of freedom and agency. She was not treated as a fragile creature to be protected and hidden away. She was treated as a potential mother of heroes, and therefore she was valued, educated, and given a voice. And it was here, in this austere and terrifying society, one of history's most extraordinary experiments in human engineering was being conducted. The Spartans were not attempting to be normal. They were not attempting to have normal lives, normal families, normal economies. They were attempting to create the perfect state, the perfect army, the perfect society, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to that vision. They would sacrifice comfort, beauty, individual freedom, family bonds, everything that makes life pleasant. They would create a machine, a state that functioned like a single organism directed toward a single purpose: victory in war. Whether one admires them or deplores them, one cannot help but recognize the audacity of what they attempted. They took a vision and they made it real. They took an idea and they bent an entire civilization to its shape. In the centuries that followed, in the classical period that we are approaching, it would be this Spartan vision that would crystallize into one of history's greatest paradoxes. A society dedicated entirely to war would produce not just warriors, but philosophers who questioned the meaning of courage. A nation that rejected art and beauty in favor of pure utility would become legendary for a spare, elegant aesthetic that has influenced Western taste for millennia. A people who enslaved hundreds of thousands would come to be remembered as champions of freedom. The contradictions within Sparta would grow only more profound as time passed, but the clarity of their vision, the unflinching dedication to their ideals, these things gave Sparta a power that would echo through Greek history, and it would be against Sparta, and in contrast to Sparta, that Athens would define itself. Section 3. The Persian Wars and the Birth of Democracy. But democracy, like any living thing, must be tested, and the test came from the east, from the vast empire of Persia, where a king sat upon a throne and believed that all the world should kneel before him. This is the truth that echoes across the centuries. The greatest moments in human history often arrive on horseback, bearing swords, and wrapped in the shadow of annihilation. It was in the year 490 before Christ that the Athenians first glimpsed the full weight of the Persian threat, and on that day something extraordinary happened in the hills of Marathon, something that would reshape not just Greece, but the entire course of human civilization. The Persian Empire under Darius I was the most powerful force the ancient world had ever known. It stretched from Egypt to India, a vast dominion of millions of souls governed by the will of a single god-king. Darius had conquered Egypt and pushed his reach into the lands of the Indus Valley. His roads connected his empire like the nervous system of some colossal beast. His treasury overflowed with gold from 100 subject peoples, and now, in his ambition, he decided that the small, fractious city-states of Greece would bow to him as well. He sent his generals and his armies across the Aegean Sea, not with the intention of negotiation, but with the absolute certainty of conquest. A Persian force of perhaps 25,000 soldiers landed near the town of Marathon, north of Athens, in 490 BCE. They carried supplies sufficient to take the city, burn it, and march onward. The Athenians, by contrast, could field perhaps 10,000 hoplites, heavily armoured foot soldiers with their bronze helmets, their round shields, their spears. Vastly outnumbered, facing an enemy they had never encountered before, an enemy whose very legend spoke of invincibility, the Athenians made a decision that still seems almost insane when you consider it across the distance of 25 centuries. They marched out to meet the Persians in open battle. There is a story told about this moment, a story that may not be entirely true, but which carries within it a deeper truth about who these Greeks were. A runner named Pheidippides is said to have covered nearly 150 miles in 2 days, running from Athens to Sparta to ask for help against the Persian invasion. The Spartans, even in their martial glory, could not send their army without first consulting the religious calendar. They refused to march during a sacred festival. So Pheidippides ran back to Athens, and the Athenians knew they would fight alone. But here is what matters most about that story. The Greeks did not despair. They did not surrender. They did not send envoys to Darius with gifts and submission. Instead, they marched. The battle at Marathon was not a chaotic collision of armies. It was a careful, almost mathematical affair. The Athenian commander Miltiades arranged his forces to take advantage of the terrain, and when the moment came, the Greeks charged at a run toward the Persian line. The Persians, accustomed to enemies who stood and received their arrows, were unprepared for this violent forward motion. The Greeks closed the distance between themselves and the enemy archers, and at close quarters, with their superior armour and their organized phalanx formation, they devastated the Persian force. 10,000 Athenians defeated 25,000 Persians, and the invaders retreated to their ships. It was a miracle, or at least it seemed like one. The news of Marathon spread across Greece like wind carrying seeds. The Athenians had defeated Persia. A small Greek city had stood against the greatest power on earth and prevailed. But this victory, as glorious as it was, would prove to be only the first movement in a much larger symphony of conflict. For Darius would not rest with this defeat, and when he died, his son Xerxes took the throne with an even greater ambition than his father. Xerxes would not send a mere expeditionary force. He would invade Greece with the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. The stories say that his forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps as many as 500,000 men, with ships numbering in the thousands. Whether these numbers are precisely accurate or inflated by Greek historians eager to amplify their victory, what is certain is this: what came was an existential threat on a scale that had never been seen before. Xerxes was coming to conquer not just a city, but an entire civilization. He was coming to erase the Greeks from the face of the earth. In 480 BCE, Xerxes crossed from Asia Minor into Europe at the Hellespont, where his engineers had built a bridge of boats across the water. The Persian army poured over this bridge like a flood, and behind it came the supply trains, the siege engines, the administrators of conquest prepared to reorganize Greek society according to the Persian model. It was then that the Greeks made another choice, and this choice would define everything that followed. The Spartans, led by their king Leonidas, and a small allied force of perhaps 7,000 hoplites, marched north to the pass at Thermopylae, a narrow bottleneck between the mountains and the sea where the terrain negated the Persian advantage in numbers. Here, in this place of fate, Leonidas took his position and resolved to hold the pass against the entire Persian army. He did not expect to survive. He had said goodbye to his wife, to his sons, to his kingdom, knowing that this would be his last stand. He had chosen 300 Spartans to accompany him, men who had agreed, as was the Spartan custom, that they would return from battle either victorious or not at all. For 3 days, Leonidas and his forces held the pass. The Persians hurled their soldiers at the Greeks in waves, and the narrow terrain meant that only a fraction of the Persian army could engage at any one time. The hoplites, with their discipline and their armour, held the line. They killed thousands of Persians, and thousands more waited behind them, unable to advance. The pass became a graveyard, a testament to the superiority of organised infantry over vast numbers of disorganised soldiers. Xerxes, watching from his command post, saw his vast army struggling against a handful of Greeks, and rage filled his heart. But then an act of betrayal changed everything. A Greek from the area, a man named Ephialtes, came to the Persian camp and offered to show them a mountain path that would allow them to outflank the Greek position. Leonidas, receiving word of this treachery, knew his fate was sealed. He could have retreated, could have saved his men, but he chose instead to hold the pass. He ordered most of the Greek force to withdraw, keeping only his 300 Spartans and perhaps 1,500 other allies to cover the retreat. They would buy time with their blood. As the Persians came through the mountain pass to take the Greeks from behind, Leonidas made his final stand. The legend says that when told the Persian arrows were so numerous that they would darken the sun, a Spartan soldier replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." Whether this was said at Thermopylae or elsewhere, it captures something essential about the Spartan spirit. A defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, a refusal to be conquered even in the moment of death. Leonidas fell, along with all of his 300. The pass was lost. Yet from this loss, something unexpected emerged. The destruction of Leonidas and the 300 became, in the Greek imagination and in historical memory, not a defeat but a triumph. These men had bought time for the rest of Greece to prepare. They had demonstrated that Persians could be killed, that the Persian army was not invincible, that the will to resist could sustain a man even unto death. The image of those 300 Spartans holding the pass became a symbol of Greek defiance that would echo through history, and Athens, in this moment, had to make a choice. Xerxes was advancing, and soon he would be at the gates of the city. The Athenians could see the smoke from burning villages as the Persian army advanced south. Themistocles, the Athenian general and strategist, looked at the situation and understood something crucial. Athens could not defeat the Persians on land. but Athens had a fleet, and the Persians, for all their might, were vulnerable at sea. Themistocles convinced the Athenians to evacuate their city. The women, the children, the elderly were put aboard ships and sent to the island of Salamis. The men stayed behind to make a final stand at sea. When the Persian fleet came into the waters near Salamis, expecting to find scattered Greek ships easily picked off one by one, they instead found themselves in a narrow strait where their superior numbers meant nothing. The Greek triremes, sleek and manoeuvrable, rammed the Persian ships with their bronze-sheathed prows. The narrow waters of the strait became a tomb for Persian vessels. In a single day of battle, the Persian fleet was shattered, and with it went Xerxes' ability to supply his army in Greece. The king, seeing his plan crumble, fled back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the invasion with the hope of still achieving victory. But the momentum had shifted. In 479 BCE, at the Battle of Plataea, a massive Greek army, larger now than before, defeated the remaining Persian forces on Greek soil. Mardonius fell. The Persian threat, which had seemed so absolute, so inevitable, was broken. The Greeks had done what no one believed possible. They had stood against the greatest empire on earth and prevailed. What is remarkable about these wars is not merely the military tactics or the courage of the warriors, though both were extraordinary. What is remarkable is what these victories meant for the future of Athens. In defeating Persia, the Athenians had confirmed something about themselves, something about the nature of free men governing themselves. They had shown that a city where the citizens voted in the assembly, where decisions were made through deliberation and debate, could stand against absolute monarchy. They had shown that democracy worked, not just in the abstract, but in the most concrete way possible, in the test of survival against a mortal enemy. The young democracy that Cleisthenes had established a generation before now stood on the world stage as a force to be reckoned with, and as the Greeks began to rebuild, as the refugees returned to their cities and the smoke cleared from the battlefields, Athens found itself in a position it had never occupied before. It was the greatest power in Greece. It was wealthy, confident, and eager to create something magnificent. The stage was set for the Golden Age. Think of it this way. Democracy had been tested in the forge of war and had not shattered. The citizens of Athens, who had once seemed like an unlikely experiment in self-governance, had proven that free people making collective decisions could stand against the most powerful empire on earth. This realization was intoxicating. It suggested that the future belonged not to autocrats and emperors, but to peoples who believed in their own capacity for reason and self-rule. And from this confidence, from this sense that anything was possible, emerged an age unlike any the world had seen before. Section 4. The Golden Age and the Flowering of the Human Spirit. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, there came a time of such extraordinary creativity, such an efflorescence of human genius, that it still seems almost unbelievable when you consider that it all happened within the span of a few decades in a single city. This was the age of Pericles, the age when Athens became not just a city but a beacon, a place where art and philosophy and drama and athletic competition seemed to converge as if guided by some invisible hand. Pericles rose to prominence in Athens in 461 BCE, and from that moment until his death in 429 BCE, he guided the city through its greatest period of development and creativity. He was not a king, Athens had no king, but a general and a statesman whose influence over the assembly was so profound that he essentially shaped the direction of the city for 30 years. And what Pericles did was extraordinary. He convinced the Athenians to spend their newfound wealth and confidence not on war, not on conquest, but on the creation of beauty. In 449 BCE, Pericles began a massive rebuilding and reconstruction of the Acropolis, the sacred hill that stood at the heart of Athens. The temples had been destroyed by the Persians, and now they would be rebuilt, but not merely rebuilt. They would be built grander, more perfect, more beautiful than ever before. This project would take nearly 15 years to complete, and it would cost an enormous amount of money and resources. There were those who opposed this spending, who argued that the money should be used for other purposes, for the military, for public welfare. But Pericles believed in something else. He believed that a city without beauty was a city without a soul. The greatest of these structures was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. It rose on the Acropolis with a mathematical precision and harmony that still takes the breath away even in its ruins. Every line was calculated, every proportion was perfect. The architects Iktinos and Callicrates worked with a sculptor named Phidias, perhaps the greatest sculptor of the ancient world, to create not just a building but a statement. The Parthenon was Athens' declaration to the world of what was possible when human beings dedicated themselves to excellence. Inside the Parthenon stood an enormous statue of Athena, made of gold and ivory and decorated with precious gems. The statue was over 40 feet tall, so large that it could be seen from the harbour of Athens. Phidias and his teams also created the sculptural decorations that adorned the Parthenon, the metopes, the frieze, the pediments. These sculptures depicted the myths of the gods and the glory of Athens, and they represented the pinnacle of human artistic achievement. When you look at them now, even broken and worn by 25 centuries of time, you can still feel the genius of the hands that carved them. But the Parthenon was only one of the structures built during this period. The Erechtheion, another temple dedicated to Athena and to Poseidon, rose nearby with its famous Porch of Maidens, where columns carved to look like young women supported the roof. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the Acropolis, was designed by Mnesicles to be impressive in its scale and its mathematical precision. Throughout the Acropolis and throughout the city, new temples and public buildings rose in a burst of creative activity that seems almost miraculous when you consider the effort required. This burst of creative energy was not limited to architecture and sculpture. In the theatres of Athens during the annual festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the greatest plays ever written in the ancient world were being performed. 4 of the greatest playwrights of all time were working in Athens during this period: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. Each of them brought something different to the stage, but all of them were exploring what it meant to be human, what it meant to be free, what it meant to live in a city where people made decisions together. Theatre in Athens was not a private entertainment for the wealthy. It was a civic institution, subsidized by the state, attended by thousands of citizens from all walks of life. The plays were performed in competition, with prizes for the best work. The festivals dedicated to Dionysus became occasions when the entire city gathered to think together about the biggest questions of human existence. Aeschylus created plays about cosmic justice and the revenge of the gods. His trilogy, the Oresteia, follows a family across generations as the cycle of vengeance is finally broken by the intervention of the goddess Athena and the establishment of human justice through a jury trial in Athens. This was not merely entertainment. It was a profound meditation on how societies move from the rule of blood revenge to the rule of law, from vendetta to justice. In Aeschylus, you can see the very moment when Athens is imagining itself as a civilization based on reason and fair judgment, rather than on tribal loyalty and endless cycles of retaliation. Sophocles wrote plays of remarkable psychological depth, exploring the tragedy that comes when human beings discover they have made terrible mistakes. His Oedipus Rex is perhaps the greatest tragedy ever written, a play about a man who, in fleeing his fate, runs directly toward it. Oedipus is a man of intelligence and determination, and yet the harder he struggles against his destiny, the more surely he moves toward it. He kills his father and marries his mother, not through wickedness, but through ignorance. And when he discovers the truth, the full horror of what he has done, the play does not look away. It forces you to contemplate the possibility that even your best efforts might lead you to the abyss, that ignorance is not bliss, but the most terrible of afflictions. Euripides was more subversive, more willing to question the traditional myths and the values of his society. His plays often ended with ambiguity, with questions left unanswered, with the certainty of nothing. Where Aeschylus and Sophocles seemed to believe that the universe had a moral order, that the gods were just, that suffering had meaning, Euripides was less certain. His characters suffer without apparent justice. The gods, when they appear, are petty and vindictive. War is shown in all its horror and futility. Yet his plays are not cynical. They are human. They look at actual people enduring actual pain, and they do not pretend to have easy answers. And then there was Aristophanes, the master of comedy, who wrote plays that were bawdy and political and hilarious, plays that made fun of the city and its leaders and its pretensions, knowing that in Athens such mockery was not forbidden, but welcomed as part of the democratic process. In a democratic city, comedy became a way of speaking truth to power without fear of retribution. Aristophanes wrote plays about war and peace, about the role of women in society, about the decline of traditional values. His play Lysistrata, where the women of Athens go on a sex strike to end a war, is a play about the absurdity of violence and the power of ordinary people to change the course of history through unconventional means. It is remarkable that a playwright could write such a play in a democratic Athens, that the city would celebrate it even as it mocked the city's leaders and the city's values. The plays were performed in the Theatre of Dionysus, built on the slopes of the Acropolis. The theatre was an open-air structure, and thousands of Athenians would come to watch the performances. The actors wore masks elaborately carved to show the character they were playing and to allow their voices to be projected to the back of the theatre. The chorus, a group of singers and dancers, moved across the stage in synchronized movements, commenting on the action and providing a connection between the audience and the story. Greek drama was not an entertainment in the modern sense. It was a form of civic ritual, a way for a community to think together about the biggest questions of human existence. Retention anchor, approximately 2,500 words. These were not merely entertainments or diversions for an idle people. The Greeks were doing something no civilization had ever attempted on such a scale. They were asking what it means to be human, what it means to be responsible, what it means to live together in a society based on justice and reason. They were asking these questions through art because they understood that some truths cannot be conveyed through logic alone. Some truths require beauty, require emotion, require the capacity to see yourself in the struggles of others. As you listen to these words in the darkness, know that the plays written in that distant time still move us today, still make us think, still help us understand ourselves. The ancient Greeks discovered something about the human heart that has never been surpassed, and it lives on in every story that moves you, in every moment when you see yourself in a character on a screen or a page. But this explosion of artistic creativity was matched and exceeded by an explosion of intellectual creativity. In Athens during this period, there arose a group of thinkers who would become the foundation of all Western philosophy. These were not mystics or prophets. They were men who believed that the human mind could understand the world through reason, observation, and dialogue. They were the philosophers, which literally means lovers of wisdom. The first of these great minds was Socrates. He was not a particularly impressive figure to look at. By all accounts, he was rather plain, even ugly, with a snub nose and bulging eyes. He did not write books, and he did not teach in the formal sense. Instead, he wandered the streets of Athens asking questions. He would approach someone, a politician, a poet, a craftsman, and he would ask them about their craft or their beliefs. What is justice, he would ask. What is courage? What is piety? What is virtue? And as the person answered, Socrates would ask follow-up questions, questions designed to show the person that they did not understand what they thought they understood. This method, known as the Socratic method, was revolutionary. It was based on the conviction that true knowledge comes not from receiving information, but from questioning your assumptions, from examining your beliefs, from being willing to admit that you don't know what you thought you knew. Socrates believed that this process of questioning and examination was not just an intellectual exercise, but a moral necessity. A life unexamined, he said, is not worth living. For an Athenian who prided himself on being a citizen of a democracy, on having a say in decisions that affected his city, this was a crucial message. You cannot be a good citizen if you do not examine your own beliefs and the beliefs of others. But Socrates' constant questioning made him enemies. The young men of Athens were drawn to him, fascinated by his method, and they began to question authority and tradition themselves. The older, more conservative citizens of Athens began to see him as a threat. In 399 BCE, when Socrates was nearly 70 years old, he was put on trial. He was accused of corrupting the youth and of impiety, of not believing in the gods of Athens. He had the opportunity to escape or to compromise, but Socrates refused. He drank the poison that the court had ordered, and he died, still questioning, still examining. His death became a kind of martyrdom, a symbol of the price that a truly free thinker might have to pay. One of Socrates' students was a young aristocrat named Plato. Plato was devastated by his teacher's death, and he dedicated his life to preserving and expanding Socrates' philosophy. Around 387 BCE, Plato founded a school called the Academy. and it would remain the most important institution of philosophical learning in the Greek world for nearly 900 years. In the academy, Plato taught his students and wrote his famous dialogues, in which Socrates, now a character in Plato's writings, discusses philosophy with various people. Plato's philosophy was in many ways a departure from Socrates' pure skepticism. Plato believed that there was such a thing as ultimate truth, and he developed his famous theory of forms. According to this theory, the physical world that we perceive with our senses is not the ultimate reality. Beyond this world of change and decay, there exists an eternal realm of perfect, unchanging forms or ideas. For example, there is no perfect chair in the physical world. All chairs are imperfect. All chairs eventually decay and rot. But the form of the chair, the ideal, perfect chair that exists in the realm of forms, is eternal and unchanging. Everything in the physical world is just an imperfect copy of one of these eternal forms. Plato used a famous image to illustrate this idea, the allegory of the cave. Imagine, Plato said, prisoners who have been chained in a cave since childhood, able to look only straight ahead. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners. These shadows are all the prisoners know of reality. But if a prisoner were freed and turned around, he would see the fire, and then gradually he could be led out of the cave into the sunlight. And finally, he could look upon the sun itself, which Plato compares to the form of the good, the highest of all forms. This allegory is a meditation on ignorance and enlightenment, on the difficulty of seeing truth, and the courage required to abandon comfortable falsehoods. It speaks to something profound about the human condition, our tendency to mistake shadows for reality, our resistance to seeing the truth, the pain that comes with enlightenment. Even now, 25 centuries later, when you encounter the allegory of the cave, something in you recognizes its truth. Plato's student was a man named Aristotle, born in Stagira in northern Greece. Aristotle was in many ways different from his teacher. Where Plato looked to an eternal realm of forms, Aristotle was fascinated by the physical world as it actually existed. He was a scientist, a biologist, a student of nature. He founded his own school, the Lyceum, and he spent his time observing the world, categorizing it, organizing it. He wrote about animals and plants, about logic and rhetoric, about ethics and politics and poetry. Aristotle believed that understanding came not through pure abstraction, but through careful observation. He would walk through the gardens of the Lyceum, discussing philosophy with his students while they moved, giving rise to his school being called the peripatetic school, the walking school. He looked at actual human beings living actual lives and asked, what do they need to flourish? What is their purpose? What does it mean to live well? Aristotle's approach to philosophy was systematic in a way that Plato's had not been. He developed a logical system for understanding the world, a way of thinking that would dominate Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. He categorized everything. He asked what things had in common and what distinguished them from one another. He looked at the physical world not as a pale shadow of some eternal reality, but as something worth studying in its own right. When Aristotle looked at a horse, he did not ask about the perfect form of horse existing in some transcendent realm. He asked, what makes this creature a horse? What are its characteristics? How does it move through the world? And from questions like these, he built a comprehensive system of logic, of physics, of biology. He was the first great scientist of the Western world, and his legacy shaped how humans would understand nature and reality for the next 2 millennia. One of Aristotle's most famous students was a young man named Alexander, who would become known as Alexander the Great. Aristotle tutored the future conqueror, and his influence on Alexander was profound. Alexander would carry the ideas of Greek philosophy and culture as far as Egypt and India, spreading Greek thought across 3 continents and founding cities that would remain centres of learning and culture for centuries. But the philosophical thinking of Athens during this period was not the domain of famous philosophers alone. All around the city, in the agora, groups of men gathered to discuss philosophy, to debate ideas, to exercise their minds. This was a culture that valued wisdom, that saw the pursuit of understanding as central to what it meant to be human. The Olympic Games, which had been celebrated since 776 BCE, took on new importance and new meaning during this period. Every 4 years, athletes from all across Greece travelled to the sacred sanctuary of Olympia to compete in honour of Zeus. The sanctuary itself was a place of extraordinary beauty, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, surrounded by temples and altars and sculptures, all dedicated to the glory of the gods and of human achievement. These were not amateur games in the modern sense, but they were different from modern professional sports. The prizes were modest, an olive wreath, a kind of sacred glory that came with being the best in your event. But the honour was immense. To win at the Olympics was to achieve a kind of immortality. Your name would be remembered, your hometown would celebrate you, and your victory would be commemorated in statues and inscriptions. Athletes who won at Olympia were heroes in the truest sense, celebrated by poets, honoured by their cities, immortalised in bronze and stone. The games were sacred in nature. A truce was declared so that athletes and spectators could travel safely, and during the games all wars and conflicts were suspended. This sacred truce, called the Echecheria, meant that even if two city-states were at war, their athletes could compete at Olympia. Imagine this. Soldiers laid down their weapons. Generals called off their campaigns. The entire Greek world paused to watch athletes compete. In a fragmented civilization perpetually divided by politics and local loyalty, the Olympics created a moment of unity, a time when all Greeks could see themselves as part of something larger than their individual cities. The Games were seen as a way of channeling the competitive urges of the Greeks into something peaceful and organised, a way of celebrating the human body and human excellence without killing. This was perhaps the greatest gift the ancient Greeks gave to civilization. The idea that competition and conflict could be transformed into ritual and sport, that the desire to test oneself and to prove one's worth did not have to result in bloodshed. CTA Anke, approximately 4,500 words. If you are listening to these words, you are listening to something produced by people who understand, as the ancient Greeks did, that storytelling is sacred. The Calm Archive creates these sleep stories not to entertain in the trivial sense, but to touch something deep within you, to help you think about what it means to be human, to be a part of a community, to pursue excellence and wisdom. The Greeks understood that the mind needs beauty and meaning, not just information. They understood that the stories we tell shape the people we become. As you continue on this journey through ancient Greece, know that you are being guided by the same impulse that guided Pericles when he built the Parthenon and guided the playwrights when they wrote their tragedies. This is the work of people who believe that you deserve beauty, that you deserve to hear stories that touch your heart and expand your mind. The athletes who competed in the Olympics competed naked, covered only in olive oil. This was not considered scandalous or inappropriate. It was seen as a celebration of the human form in its natural state, a rejection of the artificial and unnecessary. The body, in Greek thought, was not something shameful or base. It was an instrument through which the spirit and the mind could be expressed. A well-trained, disciplined body was seen as a reflection of a well-trained, disciplined mind. The athletes stood before the crowd without protection, without artifice, showing themselves as they truly were. And in that moment of exposure there was a kind of honesty and courage that the Greeks deeply respected. The events themselves were demanding. Running races of various lengths, from the stadion, a single sprint of about 600 feet, to the dolichos, a long-distance race of perhaps 24 times around the track. There was the long jump, the high jump, throwing the discus and the javelin, wrestling, boxing, and a brutal event called the pancration, which was essentially a combination of wrestling and boxing with very few rules. The only things forbidden in the pancration were eye-gouging and biting, and even these restrictions were not always observed. Men died in the pancration, crushed beneath the weight of their opponents, unable to escape. And yet athletes competed in it, knowing the risks driven by the desire to prove themselves. There were also equestrian events for those rich enough to own horses, chariot racing and horseback riding. The chariot races were particularly dangerous, with teams of horses running at full speed around a track, collisions sending chariots flying and drivers being trampled. For those competing and those watching, the Olympics were an expression of something fundamental in Greek culture, the belief that excellence was worth pursuing, that testing yourself against others and against your own limits was meaningful and important. The Olympic athletes trained hard for years, following strict diets and training regimens. They pushed their bodies to the edge of human capability. There is a story of an athlete who trained so intensely that he died at the moment of victory, his heart unable to sustain the effort he demanded of it. He was celebrated for this, for having given everything to achieve excellence, and when the great athletes competed, thousands of spectators watched, and the entire Greek world eventually heard of the results. A victor at Olympia would return to his city to celebrations that might last for days. Poets would write odes commemorating his victory. He would be granted privileges and honours for the rest of his life. The Olympics were also a social event, a gathering place where Greeks from different cities could meet and compete, where they could see each other as part of a larger whole, as Greeks rather than merely as citizens of individual city-states. The Games created a kind of unity, a sense of shared culture and shared values that transcended the political divisions between the cities. Families would travel for weeks to attend the Games. They would camp in the sanctuary, watch the competitions, eat together, exchange news and stories with people from distant lands. In a world without television or newspapers or the internet, the Olympics created a moment when all of Greece, despite its political fragmentation, could focus on the same events, could celebrate the same heroes, could feel themselves to be part of a larger community. As the 4th century BCE approached, as the decades passed and the golden age of Athens began to fade, the institutions and achievements of this remarkable period remained. The Parthenon stood on the Acropolis, a permanent monument to what was possible when a people dedicated themselves to beauty and excellence. The plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes were preserved and performed again and again. The ideas of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived on in the writings that their students had preserved. What the Greeks had created during this period was nothing less than the foundation of Western civilization. They had invented democracy and had proven that it could work. They had created art and architecture and drama that had never been surpassed. They had developed philosophy and ways of thinking about the world that shaped everything that came after. They had created the Olympic Games as a way of celebrating human excellence and human connection across the boundaries that separated them. And perhaps most importantly, they had asked the questions that still matter. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? What does it mean to be human? How should we live together? These questions are not answered once and for all. Each generation must ask them again, must examine them for themselves, must find their own answers. But it was the ancient Greeks who first asked them, who first created the forums and the institutions where such questioning could take place. In that sense, they are still with us. Every time you think about ethics, every time you participate in a democratic process, every time you appreciate beauty or witness excellence, you're participating in something that the ancient Greeks began, something they set in motion that has never stopped moving. The 300 Spartans who fell at Thermopylae were long dead. The great philosophers who had walked the streets of Athens had passed into history. The athletes who had competed at Olympia had returned to their cities and lived out their ordinary lives. But the ideas they had embodied, the structures they had created, the questions they had asked, these endured. They had invented not just a political system or an artistic style, but a whole way of thinking about what it means to live, to think, to be free, and to pursue excellence. And as you drift towards sleep, listening to these words, you are connected to them across the centuries, participating in a conversation that began in ancient Greece and has never ended. Section 5. The Weight of Empire, minutes 70 to 85. Picture yourself standing in ancient Athens in the year 431 BCE. The city is at the height of its golden age. The Parthenon gleams white on the Acropolis, newly completed. Pericles, the great statesman, has just died after a fever. He was the architect of Athens' glory, the man who built democracy into something tangible and beautiful. His funeral is a solemn affair, filled with the wails of the city's citizens. But his death marks something more than the loss of a great man. It marks the beginning of the end of Athens' unquestioned dominion over the Greek world. The cause is a war that no one wanted, but everyone felt was inevitable. For years, tension has been building between Athens and Sparta like pressure beneath the earth before an earthquake. Athens controls the sea through its brilliant navy. Sparta controls the land through its army of fierce warriors. Both city-states have grown so powerful, so convinced of their own rightness, that neither can tolerate the other's existence. And so they begin the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that will last 27 years and tear the Greek world apart from the inside. Imagine the slow horror of those years. At first, Sparta's armies march into the countryside around Athens, burning farms and olive groves, cutting down the vines that take a generation to grow. But Athens, protected by massive walls that stretch from the city down to the harbour, can simply wait. The Athenian navy rules the sea. Food and supplies come by ship. The citizens pack themselves into the city, living cheek by jowl in the crowded streets. They are safe behind their walls, they tell themselves. They are untouchable. Then, in the second year of the war, something far worse arrives than any Spartan army. It comes on the wind. It comes from the ports. It spreads through the crowded neighbourhoods like an invisible predator. History calls it the Plague of Athens, and it is one of the most devastating events in ancient history. Modern historians believe it may have been typhus or typhoid fever. What we know from the ancient sources is that people caught it and burned with fever. Sores erupted across their bodies. Their bodies rejected all food. They lay on the streets, burning and delirious, calling out to the gods for mercy that never came. 1 in 3 Athenians died. Some estimate that the population dropped from 300,000 to as few as 150,000. The social order begins to collapse. Family members abandon the sick, afraid of contagion. Bodies are piled in mass graves. The temples are crowded with people desperately seeking divine intervention, but the gods seem to have turned their faces away. The Athenians, who prided themselves on their order, their reason, their civilization, are reduced to a city of the dying, and then one day the great Pericles himself, the man who built this city into an empire, falls ill. He lasts for a few days, and then he too is gone. It is a humbling moment. No amount of silver, no military might, no philosophical wisdom could save the greatest man in Athens from a plague that cares nothing for human achievement. The city mourns not just for Pericles, but for what his death seems to symbolize, that even the greatest of human accomplishments are fragile things, subject to the whims of fate and disease and the indifference of the universe. But the war goes on. Years pass. The plague eventually burns itself out, but its impact remains. Athens is weakened. Its population is diminished. Yet the Athenian people, with the stubborn pride that defines them, refuse to surrender. Instead, they make a decision that will haunt them forever. They decide to invade Sicily. It is the year 415 BCE. For generations, the Greeks of Sicily have been watching with envy as Athens grew rich and powerful. Some of the cities in Sicily are Athenian colonies. Some are allied with Syracuse, a great city that has ties to Sparta. The Athenian assembly debates the question, should they send an expedition to conquer Sicily? The younger citizens, filled with the confidence of youth and the memory of past glories, cry out for war. They speak of the riches of Sicily, the glory that will come with conquest, the way it will expand Athenian power to the far western edge of the Greek world. An older statesman named Nicias warns against it. He speaks slowly, carefully, laying out the dangers. He speaks of the distance, the cost, the strength of Syracuse. He speaks of the way overextending their forces might leave Athens vulnerable at home. But his words are drowned out by the roar of the younger generation, shouting their enthusiasm, their hunger for glory. The assembly votes, and the decision is made. Athens will send its entire fleet to Sicily. What they send is nothing less than the greatest military expedition the Greek world has ever seen. Over 100 ships carrying more than 20,000 soldiers. The finest officers, the best generals. The army takes weeks to sail west, watching the familiar shores of Greece slip away. They travel past the coast of southern Italy, past the land of the Pythagoreans, and finally they arrive in Sicily. At first, all seems possible. The Athenian forces win a series of victories. The enemy appears to be on the brink of collapse. But then something unexpected happens. Syracuse, fighting for its survival, calls for help. And Sparta, always Athens' bitter rival, sends a general named Gylippus with reinforcements. Suddenly the tide begins to turn. The Athenians find themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies, fighting a war they cannot win. It is a slow realization, the kind that settles over you like dusk. One by one, Athenian ships are destroyed. One by one, soldiers are killed or captured. The dream of conquering Sicily becomes a nightmare of defeat. By 413 BCE, after 2 years of bloodshed, the last Athenian forces are trapped. The general Nicias, the man who had opposed this expedition from the beginning, is forced to retreat. But there is nowhere to retreat to. The Athenian forces attempt a desperate march inland, looking for any path to safety. They are harried and hunted by Syracusan cavalry. Thousands are killed, thousands more are captured and thrown into stone quarries to die slowly in the sun. Nicias himself is executed. The finest army that Athens ever sent forth is simply gone, destroyed, obliterated. The news arrives back in Athens like a second plague. A city that had prided itself on naval power suddenly discovers that its fleet has been erased. A nation that spoke of its invincibility finds that it is deeply, profoundly vulnerable. The Sicilian expedition is not merely a military defeat. It is a wound to the soul of Athens, a revelation that the city is not invincible, that it can be broken, that all the wisdom and beauty and democracy and art cannot protect you from your own hubris. The war continues for another decade. Sparta, energized by Athenian weakness, grows bolder. The Persian Empire, ever watchful from the east, begins to fund Spartan operations, sensing that a weakened Athens might finally be conquered. Year after year, the city of Athens bleeds. Its treasury is emptied. Its young men are gone, either dead or serving in some distant campaign. The walls that once seemed so protective now feel like a cage, trapping a dying animal. Finally, in 404 BCE, it is over. The Athenian fleet is destroyed in a final naval engagement. There is no hope of continuing the war. The city surrenders. Sparta's army marches in. The long walls that had connected Athens to its harbour, those magnificent walls that had been the symbol of Athenian power and freedom, are torn down. The sound of their demolition echoes through the city like a funeral bell, ringing out the end of an age. But here is something remarkable. Even in victory, Sparta finds no triumph. The city that defeated Athens finds itself in an impossible situation. Sparta's entire way of life depended on the subordination of subject states. But now, with Athens defeated, Sparta is forced to try to govern Greece. They send governors to the various cities. They attempt to maintain control through force. But Sparta was built for warfare, not governance. It was built for unity among its own people, not for ruling a diverse and complex Greek world. Within a generation, Spartan dominion begins to crumble. From the ashes of both Athens and Sparta, a new power rises. It comes from the unlikely city of Thebes, located in central Greece, a city that had largely been overshadowed by the great powers of the classical world. Thebes produces a general named Epaminondas, a man whose genius matches that of any Athenian philosopher or any Spartan warrior. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Epaminondas uses a new and revolutionary battle formation to defeat the invincible Spartan army. Sparta's myth of invincibility is shattered forever. For a brief moment, it seems that Thebes might become the dominant power in Greece. But Thebes too overextends itself. The constant warfare among the Greek city-states has exhausted them all. Greece is no longer a collection of powerful independent cities. It is a collection of weakened, battered, worn-down powers, each bleeding money and soldiers into endless conflicts with each other. They are like wolves who have fought so long and so hard that none of them have the strength to truly claim dominion over the pack. It is in this moment of weakness, this moment when all of Greece is divided and exhausted, that a new power enters from the north. His name is Philip II of Macedon, and he will do what no Greek city-state could ever do. He will unite all of Greece under a single rule, but not through the ideals of democracy, not through philosophy or persuasion, or the consent of the governed. He will do it through cunning, through an incomparable military machine, and through an understanding of human nature that is almost diabolical in its insight. Philip of Macedon is not a pure Greek, or at least the Greek cities do not see him as such. Macedon is a kingdom to the north, on the borders of Greece proper. It is a wild, mountainous land full of fierce warriors. But Philip understands something that the Greek cities have forgotten, that might and organization matter more than democratic ideals or philosophical sophistication. He builds an army like nothing the world has ever seen. He invents a new kind of cavalry, the Macedonian cavalry, which moves with terrifying speed and coordination. He redesigns the phalanx, that ancient Greek formation of spear wielders, making it more devastating, more efficient. Then he begins to move. City by city, region by region, he conquers or coerces the Greek city-states. And he is clever about it. He makes alliances with some cities. He crushes others. He plays the city-states against each other, just as they have been playing against each other for centuries. Some Greeks notice what is happening and warn against it. An Athenian orator named Demosthenes rises in the assembly and gives speeches, so famous they are later called Philippics, warning Athens to wake up. to see the danger, to resist. But by then it is too late. The Greek city-states, weakened by centuries of warfare with each other, are no match for Philip's unified army and his ruthless efficiency. By 338 BCE it is finished. Philip defeats the last combined force of Greek city-states at the Battle of Chaeronea. Greece is not destroyed, but it is conquered. Philip establishes himself as the overlord of all the Greek cities, but he does not live long to enjoy his victory. In 336 BCE, at the age of 46, he is assassinated by a disgruntled bodyguard. The throne of Macedon passes to his son. The boy is 20 years old. His name is Alexander, and he will transform the world in a way that no conqueror before or after him has ever done. He was born in 356 BCE, raised in the court of Macedon, tutored by one of the greatest philosophers in history, Aristotle himself. Aristotle taught the young Alexander about logic, about natural philosophy, about the nature of the world. The ancient historians tell us that Aristotle gave Alexander a copy of Homer's Iliad, the great epic of the Trojan War, and that Alexander carried it with him his entire life, reading it again and again. Perhaps in the stories of Achilles and Hector, Alexander saw reflections of himself, great warriors, driven by ambition, destined for immortal fame. When Alexander takes the throne, the first thing he must do is consolidate his power. The Greek cities, sensing that their overlord is now a young man, attempt to rebel. Alexander moves swiftly. He marches south and crushes any city that dares to resist. He burns the city of Thebes to the ground as an example, leaving it in such complete ruins that the Greeks never forget the lesson. Resistance to Alexander is futile. The other cities, seeing what has become of Thebes, submit without further resistance. Alexander is now, in his early 20s, the undisputed master of Greece. Section 6. The Conqueror and the World Remade. Minutes 85 to 100. But Alexander has no interest in merely ruling Greece. From his tutor Aristotle and from the epic poetry of Homer, he has imbibed a hunger that cannot be satisfied by controlling a single peninsula. He looks east, toward the great Persian Empire, the vast power that has menaced the Greeks for generations. The Persians rule from Egypt to India, an empire that seems to stretch across the entire known world. Their king, Darius III, commands armies that are so numerous that the Greek generals estimate there are over 1 million soldiers at his disposal. In 334 BCE, at the age of 22, Alexander crosses the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, with an army of perhaps 35,000 soldiers. He has spent his inheritance, sold his properties, committed every resource Macedon possesses to this venture. There is no plan for retreat. Either he will conquer the Persian Empire or he will die trying. This is not war as the Greeks have understood it. This is not a conflict between city-states, or even between nations in the conventional sense. This is the vision of a single brilliant, audacious young man who believes that he can remake the world. His first major battle is at the Granicus River, in what is now Turkey. The Persian satraps, the regional governors, attempt to block his crossing. Alexander charges directly at them with his elite cavalry guard. The Persians are shattered. Alexander's army pours across the river and the Persians flee. It is the first of many victories, and it demonstrates the superiority of Alexander's military genius and his willingness to take personal risks that would have terrified any rational commander. As Alexander marches south, the cities of Asia Minor open their gates to him. Some surrender without resistance, sensing that Alexander is something different, something new, a force that cannot be stopped. The people he conquers find that he is not a brutal oppressor. He respects their gods, honours their traditions, incorporates their cultures into his growing empire. He is not conquering to destroy. He is conquering to unite, to spread Hellenistic culture, Greek civilization, Greek learning, Greek language, across the known world. In 333 BCE, Alexander finally confronts Darius III himself at the Battle of Issus, in what is now southern Turkey. The battle is a masterpiece of tactical genius. Though Darius commands a much larger force, some accounts say over 1 million soldiers, though this is likely exaggerated, Alexander uses the terrain, his superior cavalry, and his understanding of how to concentrate force at the critical moment. He crashes through the Persian lines and drives directly toward Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing Alexander's unstoppable cavalry coming straight at him, does what no great king should ever do. He flees. He turns his horse around and gallops away from the battlefield. When the soldiers see their king fleeing, the entire Persian army breaks apart. It is a total rout. Alexander captures the Persian king's family and his baggage train, including the royal treasury. According to some accounts, he treats Darius's family with respect and courtesy, showing that he is not merely a brutal conqueror, but a man who understands mercy and nobility. But he continues to pursue Darius, determined to end the war once and for all. The next major obstacle is the great city of Tyre, a Phoenician city on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Tyre sits on an island a short distance from the mainland, and it has never been conquered because it is so well protected by the sea. The Tyrians, confident in their island fortress, refuse to surrender. So Alexander does something astonishing. He builds a causeway out into the sea, connecting the island to the mainland. It takes months of labour, and the Tyrians constantly harass the workers from their walls. But slowly, impossibly, the causeway grows. Finally, when it is complete, Alexander's army pours across, scales the walls and takes the city. He makes an example of Tyre, punishing them severely for their resistance. This is the part of Alexander's story that is often forgotten in the romantic accounts. He is capable of terrible cruelty when he deems it necessary. He's a man of his time, brutal, willing to slaughter entire cities if they resist him. Yet he is also capable of being merciful when it serves his purpose. He seems to understand, at an intuitive level, that different situations call for different responses. After the fall of Tyre, Alexander turns south and conquers Egypt. The Egyptian people, who have lived under Persian rule, initially see Alexander as a liberator. He is crowned pharaoh of Egypt, and the priests of the great temple of Amun tell him that he is the son of the god, that his true father is Amun-Ra himself, not Philip of Macedon. We will never know if Alexander believed this, or if he simply accepted the title for the political advantage it gave him. But from this moment on, Alexander begins to adopt some of the customs of the Persian court. He begins to wear Persian dress. He begins to demand that people prostrate themselves before him, as was the custom in the Persian Empire but was utterly foreign to Greek tradition. Some of his companions are troubled by this. The Greeks who followed Alexander across the world expect him to remain Greek, to maintain the values of democracy and reason that are the birthright of Hellas. But Alexander is becoming something else, a fusion of Greek, Persian, and Egyptian culture. He is becoming a god-king, not merely a general leading an army. In Egypt, Alexander founds a new city, Alexandria, on the coast of the Mediterranean. He envisions it as a great centre of learning and culture, a city that will become the jewel of the ancient world. And indeed, in time, Alexandria becomes exactly that. A city of 1 million people, famous throughout the world for its library, its museum, its scholars. It will survive for centuries after Alexander is gone, becoming the cultural heart of the Hellenistic world. From Egypt, Alexander turns his attention back east. Darius III is still alive, still attempting to organize resistance. In 331 BCE, Alexander travels across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain to confront him one final time at the Battle of Gaugamela. This battle is the climax of Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. Darius has gathered an enormous army, perhaps the largest force ever assembled up to that point in human history. The battle is a sprawling, desperate conflict. At one point it seems that the Persian forces might actually break through Alexander's line. But again, Alexander's genius asserts itself. He finds the critical point in the battle, concentrates his forces there, and crashes through with devastating effect. Darius, seeing that the day is lost, flees once more. This time he does not stop fleeing. He is later murdered by his own generals, ending the reign of the Persian Empire once and for all. With the fall of the Persian Empire, Alexander stands at the apex of human power. In just 10 years, at an age when most men are still finding their way in the world, he has conquered an empire that stretches from Greece in the west to Egypt in the south, to the border of India in the east. He has taken the ideals of Greek civilization and spread them across the known world. The Greek language becomes the lingua franca, the language of trade and learning across the vast territory he rules. Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek science begin to blend with the cultures of Egypt, Persia, and India, creating something new, Hellenistic culture, But Alexander is not satisfied. When he enters India, he finds a land of wonders, a land so vast and so alien that even his ambition begins to falter. Here, the river Hydaspes flows wide and deep, and on the other side waits the Indian king Porus with a great army and war elephants, those massive beasts that are unlike anything the Greek soldiers have ever encountered. Alexander defeats Porus in a brilliant battle, but as his army begins to march further into India, something happens. The soldiers, who have followed Alexander for thousands of miles, who have conquered empires at his command, reach a breaking point. They are exhausted, they are homesick, they have been away from home for years, and they have begun to wonder if there is any end to this conquest, any point at which Alexander will be satisfied and allow them to return home. They refuse to go further, and for the first time in his life, Alexander finds that his will, however powerful, cannot overcome the will of his own army. He stands weeping before his soldiers, furious and heartbroken that his ambitions must stop here, at the edge of India. But he understands that he cannot compel them further. Reluctantly, he turns his army around and begins the long march home. The march home is a nightmare. The army travels through the desert of the Gedrosian Peninsula, and thousands of soldiers die from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. They reach the city of Babylon in Mesopotamia, and here Alexander finally settles into something approaching a permanent residence. For several years he rules his vast empire from Babylon, continuing to blend Greek and Persian culture, continuing to inspire his people with dreams of further conquest and expansion. But in 323 BCE, Alexander falls ill. He is only 32 years old. Some sources say he contracted a fever, some say he was poisoned, some say he pushed his body so hard for so long that it simply gave out. The historians do not agree on the exact cause. What they do agree on is that Alexander, the greatest conqueror the ancient world has ever known, lies on a bed in Babylon burning with fever, aware that his time has come. His generals gather around him. They ask him who will inherit the empire, who will rule when he is gone. Alexander looks at them with the clarity of a dying man and says simply, "The strongest," and then he slips away, leaving behind an empire without an heir, an empire that is already beginning to fracture, even as its greatest son breathes his last. The news spreads across the known world like wildfire. Alexander, the man who conquered empires, who seemed invincible, who was called a god, Alexander is dead. The soldiers who had followed him across the world, the millions of people who lived under his rule, stand in shock. What happens now? What becomes of this vast empire that stretches across 3 continents? What happens is that the empire splits apart. Alexander's generals, his companions, his closest advisors, they begin to fight over his inheritance. This period is called the Diadochi, the Age of Successors. Over the course of a few decades, the empire that Alexander united is divided among his generals. Ptolemy takes Egypt and founds the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of kings who will rule Egypt for the next 300 years until Cleopatra, the last of the line, falls to Rome. Seleucus takes the vast eastern territories from Syria to India, creating the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus takes the Macedonian homeland, and in the process all of Alexander's dreams of unified empire are shattered. And yet something remarkable happens. Even though the empire fragments politically, it remains united culturally. This is the true legacy of Alexander the Great, and it is more enduring than any political empire could ever be. The Greek language spreads across the entire Mediterranean and the Near East. Greek becomes the language of government, of trade, of learning. Greeks and Persians, Egyptians and Indians begin to intermarry and intermingle. Greek philosophical schools are established in the great cities of Asia. Greek mathematics and astronomy are studied and preserved and improved upon. Greek drama, Greek architecture, Greek ideals of beauty and reason become the standard across the known world. The great library of Alexandria, that city Alexander founded, becomes a repository of human knowledge. Scholars from across the world come to study there. Works of literature, scientific treatises, mathematical papers, they're all gathered and preserved in Alexandria's vast collections. A memory anchor settles over you now, gentle as sleep itself. Every time you walk into a library and run your fingers along the spines of books, every time you open a manuscript or consult a document, you are participating in a tradition that was born in the rubble of empire, in the dream of a young man named Alexander who believed that knowledge was as important as conquest. The legacy of Alexandria, the ideal of preserved human wisdom, extends forward through the centuries, connecting us to the ancient world in ways we often take for granted. In the centuries following Alexander's death, this Hellenistic civilization spreads and deepens. The great cities of the Hellenistic world, Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, Athens itself, become centers of learning and culture. But something is changing in the world. There is a new power rising in the West, a power that will eventually eclipse even the legacy of Alexander. This power is Rome. For generations, Rome was a small city on the Tiber River, a city that traded with Greek merchants and learned from Greek culture. But Rome was building something different, a military machine of terrifying efficiency, a system of law and order, an organizational genius that matched Alexander's tactical brilliance. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome has become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. City by city, it begins to conquer the Hellenistic kingdoms that Alexander's generals created. In 146 BCE, the final blow falls. The city of Corinth, one of the great cities of the classical Greek world, rebels against Roman rule. Rome's response is swift and devastating. The Roman general Mummius marches into Corinth, conquers it, and orders the city burned to the ground. For centuries, Corinth lies in ruins, a ghostly reminder of what happens to those who resist Rome. Greece is now conquered, its independence lost, its great cities subordinate to a foreign power. And yet, in one of the great ironies of history, Greece does not conquer Rome. Rome conquers Greece, but Greece conquers Rome's culture. The Romans, a practical people, soldiers and engineers, look at Greek civilization and recognize something superior to their own. They adopt Greek gods, renaming them with Latin names but worshipping them in essentially Greek form. They adopt Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism. They study Greek rhetoric and dramaturgy. They model their architecture on Greek temples and Greek ideals. They make Greek the language of the eastern half of their empire. A Roman poet named Horace captures this paradox perfectly in a line that has echoed through the centuries. Captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror. Greece is conquered militarily, politically, militarily defeated. But culturally, spiritually, intellectually, Greece has won. Greece has conquered Rome. This is the supreme irony of history. All of the warfare among the Greek city-states, all of the exhaustion and bloodshed and defeat, in the end, it does not matter. What matters is what the Greeks created, what they invented, what they gave to the world. Democracy itself, born in Athens, that strange and beautiful and imperfect system of government, where power rests in the hands of ordinary citizens. This spreads across the world, influences the laws of Rome, and eventually becomes the template for the modern world. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, the commitment to asking hard questions about the nature of existence and morality and beauty, this becomes a permanent part of human civilization, shaping how we think, how we argue, how we understand our place in the cosmos. Science and mathematics, the empirical method, the systematic study of nature, these two are Greek gifts to the world. Euclid writes his geometry. Archimedes makes discoveries in physics and mathematics that will not be surpassed for 1500 years. Hippocrates creates the medical oath that doctors still swear today. The Pythagoreans explore the musical intervals and the relationships between numbers and beauty. The natural philosophers of Greece lay the groundwork for everything that science will become. Theatre, the dramatic arts, the stories of gods and mortals and the human condition. These Greek inventions become the template for all drama that follows. Every play written in the Western world, every movie, every television show, ultimately traces back to the Greeks and their understanding of tragedy and comedy, of plot and character, and the working out of human destiny on a stage. The Olympic Games, that ancient competition where athletes from across Greece gather to test their bodies and their courage, this too is a Greek invention. It begins as a religious ceremony honouring Zeus, but it becomes something more, a temporary peace among warring states, a place where enemies can compete against each other in contests of strength and speed, rather than in bloody warfare. The Games will be interrupted and then revived, dying out after 1500 years, only to be resurrected in the modern era as a global celebration of human athleticism. And the architecture, those columns, those perfect proportions, that sense of mathematical harmony and beauty, this becomes the vocabulary of buildings around the world. Governments, banks, museums, courthouses, They all use Greek architectural language because the Greeks understood something about what buildings should express. They understood that a structure should not merely function but should inspire, should elevate the human spirit, should express ideals of order and beauty and harmony. Every time you walk into a courtroom, cast a vote, watch a play, debate an idea, or gaze at columns on a government building, you are living in the world that Greece invented. You're surrounded by Greek ideas, thinking in Greek categories, participating in traditions that were born in ancient Athens and spread through the conquests of Alexander, and the cultural dominance of Rome, and the endless transmission of human knowledge through the centuries. The Greeks discovered that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when we are free to think, to speak, to argue, to create. They discovered that the world can be understood through reason and observation. They discovered that beauty is not an accident but something that can be sought and created. They discovered that a group of ordinary citizens gathered together can make decisions about their common future. These discoveries have shaped everything that has come after. The bronze sculptures are gone, most of them. Most. The great temples have been damaged or destroyed. The cities themselves have risen and fallen. But the ideas persist. Democracy persists. Philosophy persists. Science persists. Theatre persists. The games persist. And in that persistence, in that power to shape how human beings think and act across thousands of years and across the entire world, the Greeks have achieved an immortality that no military conqueror could ever match. The age of classical Greece, the age of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the age of Pericles and the Parthenon, the age of the city-states that invented democracy, that age has passed. But its shadow stretches across the centuries, reaching all the way to us, to this very moment, to you lying in the darkness, listening to these words and thinking about the extraordinary legacy of a small peninsula where human beings discovered something magnificent about themselves and about the world. The story of ancient Greece is not merely history, it is the story of how human civilization achieved something unprecedented, something that has never been repeated in quite the same way. It is the story of how a few city-states, by the shores of the Mediterranean, looked at the world and asked the deepest questions, and in asking those questions changed everything that came after. As you lie in the gentle darkness, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift towards sleep, you might think about those ancient Greeks, the philosophers in the Agora, the soldiers at Marathon and Thermopylae, the citizens gathering in the Assembly on the Pnyx, the athletes preparing for the Olympics, the sailors navigating by the stars, the artists sculpting in marble and bronze. They lived in a world so different from our own, and yet they are our ancestors in the most important sense, the ancestors of all the ideas that make us who we are. And even though their world is long gone, even though their cities have fallen into ruins and their empires have been conquered, their spirit persists. The spirit of inquiry, of debate, of seeking truth through reason and observation. This spirit is alive in every scientist, every philosopher, every person who dares to ask questions and seek understanding. The spirit of democracy, of believing that ordinary people are capable of self-governance. This spirit is alive in every vote cast, every law made by elected representatives, every courtroom where justice is pursued. And so the story of ancient Greece does not end. It continues, even now, in every library, every university, every moment of human learning and creativity. The Greeks discovered the power of the human mind, and that discovery echoes forward, touching us all, shaping our world, inviting us into the same grand conversation about meaning, beauty, truth, and justice that they began thousands of years ago. Let this thought carry you gently into sleep. You are part of a story that stretches back to the ancient world, connected across the centuries to the minds of the greatest thinkers and creators in human history. And the story continues. The quest for wisdom, the love of knowledge, the belief in human potential. These are not relics of the past. They are alive now in every person who seeks to understand, to learn, to create, to imagine something better. The Greeks gave us these gifts, and we, in our own time, continue the work that they began. Imagine now that you are standing on the slopes of the Acropolis, in the soft light of late afternoon, as the shadows of 25 centuries stretch across the ancient stones. The Parthenon rises before you, not as a pristine monument of ivory and gold, as it once stood in the age of Pericles, but as it exists now, weathered and broken, yet somehow more beautiful for having survived the long turning of ages. Its marble columns, fluted and graceful, still reach toward a sky that has watched over them since before the birth of Christ, and tourists walk between them in ones and twos, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor, treading the same path that Socrates walked 2,400 years ago, when these buildings were new and the democracy of Athens was still young enough to feel like an invention of yesterday. Feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on your shoulders as you stand in that sacred space. The Acropolis has always been a place of pilgrimage, whether the pilgrims come with prayers in their hearts or simply with the deep human hunger to stand where greatness once stood, to breathe the same air, to look out over the same landscape and feel somehow connected to something vast and eternal. Below you, the city of Athens sprawls in the haze, modern Athens with its apartment buildings and traffic and the ordinary business of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. Yet even they live in the shadow of the extraordinary. They grow up surrounded by these ruins, these reminders that their ancestors once asked the deepest questions about the nature of the universe and dared to invent the idea that ordinary people might govern themselves. The Parthenon itself stands incomplete, damaged by centuries of warfare and weather and the careless hands of those who saw in its marble only building materials or treasures to be plundered. Look closely at its structure, and you will see the scars of history written into every stone, the fire that burned within it when it was a temple to Athena, the centuries when it served as a Christian church and then as a mosque, the explosion in 1687 when a Venetian shell struck the building and tore away a great section of its central chamber. Yet there it stands, still magnificent, still precise in its mathematical proportions, the golden ratio evident in every line and curve, designed by men who understood that beauty itself is a kind of truth, that a structure built according to the laws of harmony and balance will endure longer in the human heart than walls built only for strength, and some of its greatest beauty has been taken away. The marbles that once decorated the Parthenon, the sculptures that told the stories of the gods and the triumphs of Athens, were removed in the early 19th century by the British diplomat Lord Elgin, who believed he was saving them from further destruction by the Ottoman rulers who occupied Greece at that time. Those sculptures, the Elgin marbles as they are now called, reside today in the British Museum in London, thousands of miles from the home they were meant to grace. It is a wound that has never quite healed, a reminder that history is not always written fairly, that power often determines what is preserved and where it is kept. For nearly 2 centuries, Greece has asked for its marbles back, and the debate continues in museums and universities and the halls of international law, a conversation about ownership and heritage and the right of a people to the artistic treasures that express their deepest values. The empty spaces on the Parthenon remain empty still, waiting, as if the building itself remembers what once adorned it and mourns the loss. But let your mind drift now from these questions of history and loss, and instead let it settle on something simpler, something that requires no effort but gratitude. Think about the gift that ancient Greece gave to the world, a gift so fundamental that it shapes the very way you think and speak and understand the universe. Every word that ends in ology comes from the Greeks. Biology and psychology and geology and astronomy and cosmology, all of them built from the Greek root logos, which means word or reason or the underlying principle of things. The ancient Greeks believed that the world could be understood, that beneath the chaos of phenomena lay an order that the rational mind could grasp, and they spent centuries seeking that order, that truth, that logos. Democracy itself, the idea that a people might govern itself, is a Greek word, born from the fusion of demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. In ancient Athens, for the first time in human history, ordinary citizens, merchants and craftsmen and farmers, gathered in the assembly and voted on the laws that governed them. It was a messy, imperfect system, riddled with the prejudices of the age, excluding women and slaves and the poorest of the poor, yet it contained within it a revolutionary idea, that the people themselves, not a king or a god, held the authority to make decisions about their own fate. Every democracy that has existed since, from ancient Rome to the modern nations of the world, owes a debt to that Athenian invention. When you vote or when you speak your mind in a gathering, you are participating in a legacy that stretches back to those agora, those public squares where citizens once debated the fate of their city-state. Philosophy itself, the love of wisdom, from philo meaning love and sophia meaning wisdom, is a Greek invention, the systematic attempt to understand the nature of reality through reason and argument and careful thought. The theatre, the theatron, the place where Greeks gathered to watch plays that explored the deepest questions of human existence, the nature of fate and justice, and the relationship between the gods and mortals. That too is Greek in its origins. Music, which the Greeks called musik, the art of the muses, and which they understood to be not merely entertainment, but a reflection of the harmony of the cosmos itself. Mathematics, geometry, the very concepts and tools that would eventually allow humans to understand the movements of the planets and the structure of atoms and the behaviour of light itself. All of these flow from the Greek tradition of rational inquiry into the nature of things. Lie back now in your mind and let yourself drift downward, away from these grand concepts, towards something more sensory, more immediate, more soothing to a mind preparing for sleep. Imagine yourself on the shore of the Aegean Sea at night, far from the cities and the tourists and the bustle of modern life. You are standing on white sand that gleams faintly in the moonlight, and before you, the sea stretches out toward the distant horizon, dark and mysterious, with a gentle luminescence where the moon touches it. The night is cool, not cold, and carries the salt scent of the sea, a smell that has not changed in millennia, that would be familiar to any Greek sailor who ever lived. Breathe in that salt air slowly, very slowly, drawing it deep into your lungs. Hold it there for a moment, holding it like a precious secret that has been kept safe for thousands of years, and then release it gently back into the night. The sound of the waves is soft and rhythmic, lapping against the shore with a patient, ancient cadence. Listen to it as you breathe, in with the scent of salt and the sound of waves. Hold it, release it, in and out, the rhythm of the sea and the rhythm of your breath becoming one thing, synchronized, peaceful. Above you, the stars wheel slowly in their courses, pinpoints of light scattered across the dark velvet of the sky, the same stars that the ancient Greeks looked up at and named. There is Orion the hunter, eternal and brilliant, with his belt of 3 bright stars forever pursuing the Pleiades across the sky. Those 7 sisters, though tradition says that only 6 of them are visible to mortal eyes, the 7th sister hidden in shame or sorrow depending on which version of the myth you follow. And there is Cassiopeia, the vain queen, eternally spinning on her throne in the heavens, doomed to circle the pole star because of her pride, and Andromeda the maiden chained to her rock, though in the myth her hero eventually came to save her. The Greeks read stories in the stars, not as abstract points of light but as narratives, as dramas unfolding above them night after night, reminding them that the heavens themselves were full of meaning and pattern. The Greeks called the universe cosmos, a word that means order, beauty, and harmony. They believed that beneath all apparent chaos and randomness, there was an underlying rational order, a beauty of proportion and mathematical relationship that could be understood by a mind sufficiently trained and prepared. That is why they built their temples with such mathematical precision, why they saw in music the expression of eternal truths, why they engaged in their long philosophical debates in the agora and the academy. They believed that the universe itself was comprehensible, that it was rational, that it was beautiful, and that human reason could grasp the principles that governed it. In this belief they were, in a sense, both right and profoundly limited. They were right that the universe does follow mathematical laws, that order does underlie apparent chaos. But they could not yet know how vast that order was, how far it extended, how many layers of reality there were beyond what the human eye could perceive or the human mind could initially comprehend. But for now, forget about those grand ideas again, and let your awareness settle into the sensory reality of the Mediterranean night. Feel the slight breeze on your face, cool and gentle, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and sage growing on the rocky slopes behind the beach. Hear the soft chirring of cicadas in the darkness, that ancient sound of summer nights, a sound that has echoed in these lands for millions of years. In the distance, perhaps a kilometre away across the water, you might hear the faint tolling of a bell, from a small monastery or a chapel built on an island, a bell that might be old enough to have been forged by monks who themselves walked in the shadow of these ancient ruins, who prayed in what had once been temples to pagan gods. The sound carries across the water in the still night air, muffled and mysterious, as if coming from another time entirely, another world. Your eyelids are growing heavy now, are they not? The rhythm of the waves, the gentle lapping of water on stone, the rhythmic tolling of the distant bell. These sounds are lulling you towards sleep. Let them. There is no need to resist. You are safe here on this shore beneath these stars that the Greeks named centuries ago. The night is deep and peaceful, and there is nothing that demands your attention, nothing that requires your wakefulness. The philosophers have finished their debates about the nature of being and becoming, about justice and virtue and the good life. They have folded their togas and gone home to rest. The theatres of Athens and the other city-states are empty now, the masks removed from the faces of the actors, the audiences having dispersed into the darkness to make their way to their homes. The athletes have finished their competitions, their bodies aching with the pleasant exhaustion of exertion, and they sleep now in their dormitories or their homes, dreaming the dreams of those who have tested themselves and found themselves equal to the test. The ships that sailed from Piraeus to distant ports in Egypt and Phoenicia and Ionia have moored in the harbours, their sails furled, their crews sleeping in the holds or on the deck, rocked by the gentle motion of the water. The fires in the homes and the temples and the agora are banked now, reduced to glowing embers that cast a faint red light and emit a faint warmth, but they no longer demand attention or tending. The great Aegean Sea stretches out, vast and patient, its surface touched by moonlight, its depths mysterious and profound, and it is still, so still that you can hear each individual wave, each breath of wind across its surface, each whisper of the tide as it turns, and all around you, in the darkness beyond the reach of the moonlight, the land of Greece sleeps. The olive trees sleep in their groves, those ancient gnarled olive trees that have stood for centuries, their trunks thick and twisted with age, their leaves silvery in the moonlight, their roots driving deep into the soil that has been cultivated for thousands of years. According to the myth, it was Athena who first planted an olive tree on the Acropolis, and in gratitude the people of Athens made her the patron goddess of their city. That first tree is long gone now, but olive trees still grow in the same sacred places, still produce their fruit as they have done since the age of heroes. There is something about an olive tree that speaks to the passing of time, to the persistence of beauty and utility across the ages. It grows slowly, demands little, produces abundantly, and can live for centuries, even millennia. Let your imagination follow the roots of one of these ancient olive trees deep into the earth, down past the soil and the stones, down into the darkness where water flows and minerals dissolve, and the very bedrock of the earth holds the memory of ages past. The tree above sends its roots downward, seeking sustenance, seeking moisture, seeking connection to the deep sources of life. And the tree itself grows upward, slowly, patiently, adding a ring of new wood each year, a growth ring that corresponds to the rains of that year, a kind of autobiography written in rings of wood. If you could cut through an olive tree that has lived for 2,000 years, you would see those rings, each one a year, each one a record of what that year was like for the tree. Abundant rains would produce a thick ring, a drought year a thin one. The tree is a history written in wood, a patient record of the passage of time. In the calm of the night these trees stand in their groves and the moonlight filters through their leaves, casting dancing shadows on the earth. The air carries the scent of them, a subtle, ancient smell, the smell of Mediterranean hills and ages past. If you could walk through one of these groves, your feet would tread on earth that has been tilled and cultivated for 3,000 years, earth that has known the feet of philosophers and priests, of soldiers and farmers, of refugees fleeing war and artists seeking inspiration. That earth holds memory, holds the accumulated presence of all the generations that have walked upon it. But your eyes are closing now, are they not? You can barely keep them open. Let them close. There is nothing to see in the darkness but the faint glow of the stars and the moon, and you can see those even with your eyes closed. The moon is so bright that you can feel its light even through your eyelids. The sound of the waves grows softer as your awareness recedes, or perhaps it simply grows less urgent, less demanding of your attention. It becomes part of the fabric of night itself, part of the texture of darkness, a gentle rhythm that your body recognizes and sinks into, the way an infant sinks into sleep at the sound of a lullaby. Imagine yourself now in the ruins of the Acropolis, not as a visitor but as a ghost, a presence without form drifting among the columns and broken stones. The tourists have gone home, the souvenir shops are closed, the city of Athens below sleeps, and only the ancient stones remain awake, and you move among them like a whisper. like a memory of a memory. The Parthenon looms above you, its columns creating a network of shadows and pale stone, the cracks and damage visible in the moonlight, yet still beautiful, still magnificent in the way that broken things can sometimes be more moving than perfect things, because they have survived, because they bear witness to the passage of time and yet remain. You drift past the Erechtheion, that smaller temple dedicated to Athena and Poseidon, with its famous porch of the caryatids, marble maidens whose heads support the roof on their patient shoulders. These sculptures are copies now. The originals are in museums for preservation, yet standing there they still possess a strange presence, a sense of watchfulness, of eternal vigil. You drift past the smaller temples and altars, past the stones that once formed the theatre of Dionysus, where the greatest plays of human civilization were first performed, where audiences wept and laughed, and felt the full weight of human possibility and human limitation revealed in the words of poets. This is the Calm Archive's gift to you now, dear friends. Not the gift of perfect sleep, though sleep will come, but the gift of this moment, this time of transition between wakefulness and dream, when your mind is still conscious enough to experience beauty, but your body is already beginning to surrender to rest. Many of history's greatest thinkers reported that their best insights came in this liminal state, in the moment before sleep or in the moment of waking, when the rational mind loosens its grip and the deeper, more intuitive mind begins to emerge. Archimedes had his insight about displacement while bathing. Newton saw the apple fall and made the connections that would lead to his laws of motion. Kekulé dreamed the structure of the benzene ring. In this state between waking and sleeping, your mind has access to different kinds of knowledge, different ways of understanding. Allow yourself to drift now in that space where the boundary between self and world grows soft and permeable. You're no longer quite separate from the moonlight on the Aegean. You are the moonlight, reflecting and dancing on the surface of the water. You're the whisper of wind through the olive groves, the faint tolling of the distant bell, the patient breathing of the earth and sky. Your sense of separate selfhood is dissolving gently, like salt dissolving in water, losing its sharp edges but not disappearing, simply becoming part of something larger, something that includes the night sky and the ancient stones, and the memory of all the people who have ever looked up at the stars and wondered at their meaning. The questions that the Greeks asked so long ago, questions about justice and virtue and the nature of reality and the possibility of happiness, these questions still echo in your mind as you drift towards sleep. You do not need to answer them. You do not need to reach any conclusion. Simply hold them gently in your awareness, the way you might hold a beautiful stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its texture, its coolness, but not needing to understand it or change it, or make it into something other than what it is. The stone is beautiful precisely because it is itself, complete and whole, asking nothing of you but attention. Your breath has slowed now. You're breathing in rhythm with the waves, with the great tides that move the oceans and the smaller tides that move through your own body. The circulation of blood, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the flow of air through your lungs. All of these tides are connected, all part of the same cosmic dance that the Greeks understood when they said that the universe was made of the same fundamental substances, that the stars above were made of the same elements as the earth beneath your feet, that the same laws governed the movements of planets and the growth of olive trees and the beating of your heart. The Aegean is still now. In your mind's eye, the surface of the sea has become like glass, perfectly smooth, perfectly reflective. The stars above are mirrored perfectly in the water below, so that it becomes impossible to tell where the sea ends and the sky begins, as if the universe is folded back on itself, as if up and down have lost their meaning. In this space, without boundaries, without directions, without the usual markers of separation, you float gently, held by a vastness that is not hostile or indifferent, but perfectly, calmly accepting. The philosophers have finished their debates, the theatres are empty, the athletes have gone home, the ships are moored in the harbour, the fires are banked, the Aegean is still, the wind has ceased. Even the cicadas have fallen silent, as if the night itself is holding its breath, waiting for something, for dawn, perhaps, or for the sleep of a dreamer to deepen into the profound unconsciousness where dreams themselves cease, and there is only rest, only renewal, only the patient turning of the body toward healing. And as you sink deeper and deeper into that sleep, as the last vestiges of wakefulness dissolve away, remember that you are resting beneath the same stars that looked down on Socrates as he walked the streets of Athens, the same stars that guided ships across the wine-dark sea, the same stars that have circled the pole for billions of years and will continue to circle long after your own short life is finished. You are part of that vast continuity of human existence, of consciousness reflecting on itself, of the universe becoming aware of its own beauty through the eyes of those who stop to notice it. Sleep well beneath those stars, dear friends. Sleep well in the knowledge that countless generations before you have slept beneath the same sky, have feared the same fears, have hoped the same hopes, have loved and lost and laughed and wept just as you do. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You are part of something immense and ancient and beautiful, something that stretches back thousands of years and will stretch forward thousands of years more. And in this moment, in this night, you are exactly where you need to be, resting where the Greeks once rested, breathing the same Mediterranean air, watching the same stars wheel across the sky. Sweet dreams, dear friends. Sweet dreams. Sleep well beneath the stars that the Greeks first named. Tomorrow will come with its own demands and its own challenges, but tonight is for rest, for the restoration of your body and your mind, for the mysterious process by which sleep heals and renews. Tonight you are safe. Tonight you are home. Tonight you are part of the endless peaceful turning of the earth beneath the eternal sky.